It's time for another warm-up review. Let's get going. Which organelle in cytochrome are particularly important in intrinsic apoptosis? So the organelle is going to be the mitochondria, and that's going to be releasing cytochrome C. Next question, what is the embryologic origin of the tissue just proximal to the pectinate line? And then what is the origin of the tissue just distal to the pectinate line? So first we have the proximal to the pectinate line, that's going to come from endoderm. And then the tissue distal to the pectinate line is going to be derived from surface ectoderm. Next, excessive amounts of which vitamin should be avoided during pregnancy? And the answer is going to be vitamin A, because excess vitamin A can cause miscarriage and severe birth defects like cardiac abnormalities and cleft palate. All right, that brings us to the end of the warm-up. Let's get to that lecture now.
In a previous video, we talked about the functional organization of the cerebral cortex. Now we're going to peel back the cortex and discuss some of the deeper cerebral structures, including the limbic system and the hypothalamus. So let's start with the hypothalamus, which is important for regulating a lot of your body's automatic processes like body temperature, hunger and thirst, sleep and circadian rhythms, and the endocrine system, which it does by regulating the pituitary gland. Now, you won't be tested on the physical location of specific hypothalamic nuclei, but it may be worthwhile to know some of the specific functions of specific nuclei. Now, this is about a 3-star topic. Many of you will have a question on the hypothalamus. So take a look at the study guide and let's fill in some of the blanks. The first 5 nuclei are all in the anterior hypothalamus, and they have names like the supraoptic nucleus and the preoptic nucleus because they're up front near the eyes. The anterior nucleus is where thermoregulation takes place. The anterior nucleus helps us dissipate heat and cool off by sweating and so on. Now, lots of students remember AC, like air conditioning, for anterior cooling. And then if there's damage to the anterior nucleus, that leads to hyperthermia. Next is the suprachiasmatic nucleus, which is exceptionally charming and really inspires devotion in others. No, wait a minute. That's the suprachiasmatic nucleus. This is the suprachiasmatic nucleus because it sits right above the optic chiasm. The suprachiasmatic nucleus is considered the master clock for our bodies because it sets our circadian rhythms. This area receives input from the retinas to determine if it's day or night. So when you become tired at night, it's due to the action of the suprachiasmatic nucleus. And actually, lots of hypothalamic nuclei play a role in wakefulness and arousal. But when you think about circadian rhythms, I want you to primarily think of the suprachiasmatic nucleus. The preoptic area is a tiny cluster of nuclei, and I want you to remember that they secrete GnRH, or gonadotropin-releasing hormone. That's the hormone that stimulates the release of gonadotropins, LH and FSH, from the anterior pituitary. The hypothalamus secretes a bunch of releasing hormones that regulate the anterior pituitary. The supraoptic nucleus regulates water balance by secreting ADH, or antidiuretic hormone. And then ADH is transported down the pituitary stalk and stored in the posterior pituitary. There are only 2 hormones that come from the posterior pituitary, and ADH is one of them. The other is oxytocin. Now, what happens if you damage the supraoptic nucleus and you can't make ADH? This causes a disease called central diabetes insipidus, or central DI. We're going to talk about that in the renal section because central diabetes insipidus results in the inability to concentrate the urine. And then the paraventricular nucleus makes oxytocin. And again, oxytocin gets stored in the posterior pituitary. So both hormones of the posterior pituitary come from the anterior hypothalamus. The paraventricular nucleus also secretes corticotropin-releasing hormone and thyrotropin-releasing hormone, so it's regulating the anterior pituitary's production of ACTH and TSH. The middle of the hypothalamus is sometimes called the tuberal hypothalamus because it's adjacent to the tuber cinereum, which is the little hollow funnel that leads down into the pituitary stalk. But anyway, the next 4 nuclei are all located in the tuberal hypothalamus. The arcuate nucleus has a bunch of functions. It secretes growth hormone-releasing hormone, which again is a releasing hormone that regulates the anterior pituitary. It secretes dopamine, which regulates the anterior pituitary by inhibiting the release of certain pituitary hormones like prolactin. The arcuate nucleus is also involved in making sure that gonadotropin-releasing hormone is released in a pulsatile manner, which is important for normal ovulation. So both the preoptic nucleus and the arcuate nucleus are involved in GnRH secretion. And then the arcuate nucleus also helps to regulate the appetite, which is sort of a common theme of all of these tuberal nuclei. The lateral nucleus regulates and stimulates hunger. So stimulation of the lateral nucleus makes you hungry. And there's an important hormone called leptin that produces satiety. So the lateral nucleus is inhibited by leptin. And if you damage the lateral nucleus, you won't get hungry, which leads to anorexia or loss of appetite and weight loss. Then the ventromedial nucleus is the opposite. This one regulates satiety, so it can be stimulated by leptin. And damage to the ventromedial nucleus will result in increased appetite and obesity, and also savage behavior for some reason. And finally, the dorsomedial nucleus also regulates hunger, and stimulation of this one causes obesity and savage behavior. And finally, there are just two nuclei in the posterior hypothalamus. The posterior nucleus is involved in thermoregulation again, but opposite of the anterior nucleus. This one helps you warm your body when you're cold through shivering and piloerection and so forth. And damage to the posterior nucleus will result in an inability to remain warm in cool environments and eventually hypothermia. So the posterior nucleus is the opposite of the anterior nucleus. Makes sense. And finally, the mammillary nuclei are found in the mammillary bodies, which is part of the limbic system. The mammillary bodies are involved with memory, and damage to the mammillary bodies causes something called Wernicke-Korsakoff syndrome, which we'll talk about when we discuss the limbic system. Let's go back to circadian rhythms for a moment. What part of the hypothalamus was involved in setting circadian rhythms? The suprachiasmatic nucleus. Well, let's talk briefly about the hormone melatonin, which is also involved in circadian rhythms and arousal and wakefulness. Melatonin is secreted by the pineal gland, and it helps to regulate behaviors based on the seasons and the amount of natural light that's available. Melatonin tends to be produced in darkness. So in the winter, when the days are shorter and there's less natural light, the pineal gland produces more melatonin. And among other things, melatonin suppresses the production of LH and FSH, and it suppresses libido. So sex drive may be relatively inhibited in the winter months. But then in the spring, when the days are getting longer and there's more sunlight, the sunlight suppresses melatonin production and the sex drive is stronger, which explains why animals tend to mate in the springtime. Melatonin secretion also follows the circadian rhythm that's established by the suprachiasmatic nucleus, so that melatonin secretion peaks around midnight and then it tails off during the day. And this provides information to the rest of your body about the length of the nighttime. So the pineal gland and melatonin play a role in the sleep-wake cycle, but not as important a role as the suprachiasmatic nucleus does. Now, since the hypothalamic nuclei are the highest yield part of this video, let's do a little review. Welcome to our Doctors in Training game show, Name That Nucleus. In today's game, I'm going to put some clues up on our big game board, and I want you to shout out the correct hypothalamic nucleus. Ready to play? Let's go. Our first clue, located in the anterior hypothalamus, damage to this nucleus causes dilute urine and secretes antidiuretic hormone. That's the supraoptic nucleus. Next, stimulation of this nucleus increases the appetite. Damage to this nucleus causes anorexia and weight loss. And leptin inhibits this nucleus. That's the lateral nucleus. Next, regulates the secretion of TSH, regulates the secretion of ACTH, and secretes oxytocin. That's the paraventricular nucleus. Next, receives input from the retina, controls circadian rhythms, and is known as the master clock. That's the suprachiasmatic nucleus. And our last one, damage to this nucleus leads to savage behavior. Damage also leads to obesity. And this nucleus is stimulated by leptin. This is the ventromedial nucleus. That's all the time we have for today's game, but tune in next time for Name That Nucleus. Another deep part of the brain is the limbic system. The limbic system is the part of the brain that controls emotional behavior and motivational drives. Sometimes we say the limbic system is responsible for the 5 F's: fighting, fleeing, feeding, feeling or emotions, and sex, fornication. So you can think of the limbic system as the primitive part of the brain, kind of like a caveman brain that says, hungry, need food, or need sleep, need sex. It's the animal part of the brain, or what Freud called the id. The limbic system is also involved in learning and memory. So we hope that your limbic system is engaged right now and that you're going to be able to remember all this stuff that you're packing into your brain come test day. The limbic system is closely tied to the pleasure centers of the brain, which makes sense if it's going to be ruling the emotions. It's also closely tied to the prefrontal cortex, which is involved in executive functions and problem solving, as well as personality. So when your prefrontal cortex is busy solving a difficult puzzle or solving a problem, it's also communicating with the limbic system and the pleasure centers, which is why we get pleasure and a sense of accomplishment from solving problems. And the prefrontal cortex is also responsible for inhibiting the limbic system, so we aren't constantly acting on those animal instincts. The limbic system consists of the cingulate gyrus, the fornix, the hippocampus, which is important for memory, the septal nucleus, the mammillary bodies, and the amygdala. The amygdala is a group of nuclei that receives inputs from lots of different parts of the cortex, and it's involved in summation of signals from all over: the limbic cortex, the parietal cortex, the temporal cortex, the occipital lobes, and especially from the auditory and visual association areas. So the amygdala is a site of summation of a lot of different signals and inputs. And then the amygdala transmits signals back to the cortical areas from which it received those inputs. Now, what happens when you stimulate the amygdala? Well, it can increase or decrease arterial blood pressure and heart rate. It affects GI motility and secretion, defecation, urination, that sort of thing. It influences the secretion of various anterior pituitary hormones. Stimulating the amygdala also results in movements related to eating, such as licking and chewing and swallowing. And it can trigger negative emotions, things like fear, rage, and aggressive behavior, and also awareness of invasion of personal space. So if you're studying and someone's standing a little too close and reading your notes over your shoulder, it's your amygdala that makes you feel uncomfortable with that. And stimulation of the amygdala can also trigger complex sexual responses, such as erection, copulatory movements, and ejaculation. So the amygdala is connected to the autonomic nervous system and also connected to emotions and sexual arousal and eating. So again, it's a very primitive, primordial part of your brain. Now, the amygdala is a paired structure, meaning there's one on each side of the brain. And if you get lesions in the amygdala bilaterally, that leads to something called Kluver-Bucy syndrome, which is characterized by an interesting constellation of behaviors. First of all, the patient's not afraid of anything, so they lose the fear response. That makes them fairly disinhibited because they don't fear people or they don't fear danger. So if you take an animal and you lesion both of the amygdalae, the animal no longer is going to fear predators or fear the dominant member of the group. The animal doesn't become aggressive, they just sort of become docile. And we can see that in humans with Kluver-Bucy syndrome as well. At the same time, these patients are extremely curious about everything. They also exhibit hyperorality, or an oral fixation, where they place everything in their mouth, even eating solid objects sometimes. Now, I like to think about the girl in the musical Hairspray, Tracy's friend Penny. Penny's constantly sucking on a lollipop. She's fairly docile. She kind of just goes along with whatever the rest of the gang is doing. She doesn't really even seem to have any fear of disobeying her mother and bucking the established social order. And then one other feature of Kluver-Bucy syndrome is hypersexuality. These patients have a sex drive so strong that the patient may even attempt to have sex with animals. Now, that didn't make it into the movie. Maybe it's in the extended director's cut. Anyway, that's the amygdala. Let's talk about some other lesions of the limbic system. We said that the hippocampus is important for memory, especially making new memories. So bilateral hippocampus lesions can result in anterograde amnesia. Another part of the limbic system involved in memory is the mammillary bodies, which again houses the mammillary nuclei. We said that destruction of the mammillary bodies results in something called Wernicke-Korsakoff syndrome. Now, Wernicke-Korsakoff syndrome is most commonly seen in alcoholics who become deficient in thiamine, or vitamin B1. Wernicke-Korsakoff syndrome is characterized by nystagmus and ophthalmoplegia, ataxia, and encephalopathy, confusion and disorientation. And then eventually they can develop anterograde and retrograde amnesia. So there's the memory connection. And sometimes these patients will exhibit confabulation, where they can't remember something, so they make something up to fill in the gaps of their memory. It's called confabulation. It's pretty striking when you see it. Now it's time for the end of session quiz. So go ahead and pause the video and complete that, and then we'll go through the answers. First question: which hypothalamic nuclei fit each of the following descriptions? Savage behavior and obesity result from stimulation. That's the dorsomedial nucleus. Savage behavior and obesity result from destruction. That's the ventromedial nucleus. The master clock for setting circadian rhythms is the suprachiasmatic nucleus. Releases hormones affecting the anterior pituitary. There are several of these. You have the arcuate nucleus, the preoptic nucleus, and the paraventricular nucleus. So those are the three main ones. Responsible for sweating and cutaneous vasodilation in hot temperatures. That's the anterior nucleus. responsible for shivering and decreased cutaneous blood flow in the cold, that's the posterior nucleus, produces ADH to regulate water balance, that's the supraoptic nucleus, regulates the release of gonadotropic hormones, that's the preoptic nucleus and the arcuate nucleus. Destruction results in inability to stay warm, that's the posterior nucleus, receives input from the retina, that's the suprachiasmatic nucleus, which receives that retinal input to regulate circadian rhythms. Stimulation leads to eating, and destruction leads to anorexia, that's the lateral nucleus. And then destruction results in diabetes insipidus, that's the supraoptic nucleus because it produces ADH. Next, deficiency of what nutrient causes damage to the mammillary bodies? That's thiamine deficiency or vitamin B1, most commonly due to alcoholism. And the last question. A patient is evaluated for behavior and personality changes. She used to be argumentative and aggressive, but she's become fairly quiet and docile. She's also become socially disinhibited and has been making inappropriate sexual advances toward friends, relatives, and strangers. During the interview, you note the patient's tendency to chew on pens, chew on her fingers, chew on her necklace. The damage to what neurologic structure might account for these behaviors? So this presentation suggests Kluver-Bucy syndrome, docile behavior, disinhibition, hypersexuality, and hyperorality. And Kluver-Bucy syndrome is caused by bilateral amygdala lesions. All right, that's it for now. I'll see you next time.
Welcome to my show. I trust you're doing well out there. And you, Monster, how are you feeling? That's too bad, buddy. I promise to look in it right after the show. But for now, we have a caller. Colin, you're on the line.
Yeah, I was wondering, which hypothalamic nuclei are involved with controlling the appetite?
This is a great question, Colin, and a fantastic way to kick off our show. Colin, the lateral nucleus and the ventromedial nucleus are involved with controlling the appetite. Stimulating the lateral nucleus leads to hunger, while stimulating the ventromedial nucleus leads to satiety. And the hormone leptin is important in regulating appetite because leptin inhibits the lateral nucleus and stimulates the ventromedial nucleus. So leptin causes satiety. And one more thing. Destruction of the ventromedial nucleus leads to increased appetite, obesity, and savage behavior. We're good. But it is time for a commercial break, so please don't change the channel.